Human spaceflight is space travel with a crew aboard the spacecraft. When a spacecraft is crewed, it can be operated directly, as opposed to being remotely operated or autonomous. The first human spaceflight was launched by the Soviet Union on 12 April 1961 as a part of the Vostok program, with cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin aboard. Humans have been continually present in space for 7008479869552000000 15 years and 76 days on the International Space Station. Since the retirement of the U.S. Space Shuttle in 2011, only Russia and China have maintained domestic human spaceflight capability with the Soyuz program and Shenzhou program. Currently, all crewed flights to the International Space Station use Soyuz vehicles, which remain attached to the station to allow quick return if needed. The United States is developing commercial crew transportation to facilitate domestic access to ISS and low Earth orbit, as well as the Orion vehicle for beyond low Earth orbit applications. While spaceflight has typically been a government-directed activity, commercial spaceflight has gradually been taking on a greater role. The first private human spaceflight took place on 21 June 2004, when Spaceship One conducted a suborbital flight, and a number of non-governmental companies have been working to develop a space tourism industry. NASA has also played a role to stimulate private spaceflight through programs such as Commercial Orbital Transportation Services and Commercial Crew Development. With its 2011 budget proposals released in 2010, the Obama administration moved towards a model where commercial companies would supply NASA with transportation services of both crew and cargo to low Earth orbit. The vehicles used for these services could then serve both NASA and potential commercial customers. Commercial resupply of ISS began 2 years after the retirement of the shuttle, and commercial crew launches could begin by 2017. History. First human spaceflights. Human spaceflight capability was first developed during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, which developed the first intercontinental ballistic missile rockets to deliver nuclear weapons. These rockets were large enough to be adapted to carry the first artificial satellites into orbit around the Earth. After the first satellites were launched in 1957 and 1958, the U.S. worked on Project Mercury to launch men singly into orbit, while the USSR secretly pursued the similar Vostok program. The USSR launched the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into a single orbit in Vostok 1 on a Vostok 3 kA rocket, on 12 April 1961. The U.S. launched its first astronaut, Alan Shepard, on a suborbital flight aboard Freedom 7 on a Mercury Redstone rocket, on 5 May 1961. The first American in orbit was John Glenn aboard Friendship 7, launched 20 February 1962 on a Mercury Atlas rocket. The USSR launched 5 more cosmonauts in Vostok capsules, including the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova, aboard Vostok 6 on 16 June 1963. The U.S. launched a total of 2 astronauts in suborbital flight and 4 in orbit through 1963. U.S. President John F. Kennedy raised the stakes of the space race by setting the goal of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely by the end of the 1960s. The U.S. started the 3-man Apollo program in 1961 to accomplish this, and the 2-man Project Gemini, which flew 10 missions in 1965 and 1966 to support Apollo by developing American orbital spaceflight experience and techniques to be used in the Moon mission. The USSR remained silent about their intentions to send humans to the Moon, and launched 2 competitive Voskhod orbital flights in 1964, achieving the first spacewalk by Alexei Leonov on Voskhod 2 on 8 March 1965. The U.S. Gemini flights did not accomplish the first spacewalk. but demonstrated several spacewalks and solved the problem of astronaut fatigue caused by the lack of gravity. The Gemini flights also demonstrated up to 2 weeks endurance in a human spaceflight, and achieved the first space rendezvous and dockings of spacecraft. The U.S. developed the Saturn V rocket necessary to send the Apollo spacecraft to the Moon, and sent Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders into 10 orbits around the Moon in December 1968. On July 21, 1969, Apollo 11 accomplished Kennedy's goal by landing Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the Moon and returning them safely, along with Command Module pilot Michael Collins. A total of 6 Apollo missions landed 12 men to walk on the Moon through 1972, half of which drove electric-powered vehicles on the surface. The crew of Apollo 13 Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes survived a catastrophic in-flight spacecraft failure and returned to Earth safely without landing on the Moon. The USSR secretly pursued a human lunar orbiting and landing program, but failed to develop the N-1 rocket necessary for a human landing. Ing discontinued its program in 1974. They successfully developed the 3-person Soyuz spacecraft for use in the lunar program, but on losing the Moon race, turned to the development of space stations, using the Soyuz as a ferry to take cosmonauts to and from the stations. They started with a series of Salyut sortie stations, followed by the development of Mir, the first modular, semi-permanent space station, the construction of which started in 1986. After the Apollo program, the U.S. launched the Skylab space station in 1973, manning it with 3 Apollo spacecraft crews. President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev negotiated an easing of relations known as détente, an easing of Cold War tensions. As part of this, they negotiated the Apollo-Soyuz test project, in which an Apollo spacecraft carrying a special docking adapter module rendezvoused and docked with Soyuz 19 in 1974. The American and Russian crews shook hands in space, but the purpose of the flight was purely diplomatic and symbolic. The two nations continued to compete rather than cooperate in space, as the U.S. turned to developing a reusable space shuttle which it intended to follow with its own permanent space station, Freedom. The space shuttle started flying in 1981, but the U.S. Congress failed to approve sufficient funds to make Freedom a reality. U.S.-Russian cooperation milestones. Svetlana Savitskaya became the first woman to walk in space on 25 July 1984. From 1981 to 2011, the U.S. conducted all its human spaceflight missions with reusable space shuttles. Sally Ride became the first American woman in space in 1983. Eileen Collins was the first female shuttle pilot, and with shuttle mission STS-93 in 1999 she became the first woman to command a U.S. spacecraft. China became the third nation to achieve independent human spaceflight capability when Yang Liwei launched into space on a Chinese-made vehicle, the Shenzhou 5, on 15 October 2003. The first Chinese woman, Lu Yang, was launched in June 2012 aboard Shenzhou 9. Previous European and Japanese domestic human spaceflight programs were abandoned after years of development, as was the first Chinese attempt, the Shuguang spacecraft. The longest single human spaceflight is that of Valery Polyakov, who left Earth on 8 January 1994, and did not return until the 22nd of March 1995. Sergei Kriklyov has spent the most time of anyone in space, 803 days, 9 hours, and 39 minutes altogether. The longest period of continuous human presence in space is 7008479869552000000, 15 years and 76 days on the International Space Station. exceeding the previous record of almost 10 years held by Mir, spanning the launch of Soyuz Trademark 8 on 5 September 1989 to the landing of Soyuz Trademark 29 on 28 August 1999. For many years beginning in 1961, only two countries, the USSR and the United States, had their own astronauts. Citizens of other nations flew in space, beginning with the flight of Vladimir Remek, a Czech, on a Soviet spacecraft on 2 March 1978. In the Intercosmos program. As of 2010, update, citizens from 38 nations have flown in space aboard Soviet, American, Russian, and Chinese spacecraft. Post-Space Shuttle era under the Bush administration. The Constellation program included plans for retiring the shuttle program and replacing it with the capability for spaceflight beyond low Earth orbit. In the 2011 United States federal budget, the Obama administration canceled Constellation for being over budget and behind schedule while not innovating and investing in critical new technologies. For beyond low Earth orbit human spaceflight, NASA is developing the Orion spacecraft to be launched by the Space Launch System. Under the Commercial Crew Development Plan, NASA will rely on transportation services provided by the private sector to reach low Earth orbit, such as SpaceX's Falcon 9, Dragon V2, Sierra Nevada Corporation's Dream Chaser, or Boeing's CST-100. The period between the retirement of the shuttle in 2011 and the initial operational capability of new systems in 2017, similar to the gap between the end of Apollo in 1975 and the first space shuttle flight in 1981, is referred to by a presidential Blue Ribbon Committee as the U.S. human spaceflight gap. Commercial suborbital spacecraft aimed at the space tourism markets such as scaled composite Spaceship Two to be operated by Virgin Galactic, and XCOR's Lynx spaceplane are under development and could reach space before 2017. Space programs. Human spaceflight programs have been conducted by the former Soviet Union and current Russian Federation, the United States, the People's Republic of China, and by private spaceflight company, Scaled Composites. Current programs. Space vehicles are spacecraft used for transportation between the Earth's surface and outer space, or between locations in outer space. The following space vehicles and spaceports are currently used for launching human spaceflights. Soyuz spacecraft on Soyuz launch vehicle, launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome, 128 orbital flights since 1967, including one in-flight abort which failed to reach orbit, as of December 2015. Update. Shenzhou spacecraft on Long March rocket, launched from Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center, Shenzhou, 2003. Present, 5 flights since 2003. As of December 2015. Update. The following space stations are currently maintained in Earth orbit for human occupation. International Space Station assembled in orbit. Altitude 409 kilometers, 51.65 degrees inclination. Crews transported by Soyuz spacecraft. Tiangong-1. Altitude 363 kilometers, 42.77 degrees inclination. Crews transported by Shenzhou spacecraft. Historical programs. The following space vehicles have been used in the past for human spaceflight, with the spaceports they were launched from. Vostok capsule on Vostok K launch vehicle, 6 orbital flights from 1961 to 1963, from Baikonur Cosmodrome. Mercury capsule, 2 suborbital flights on Mercury Redstone launch vehicle in 1961, 4 orbital flights on Atlas LV-3B in 1962 and 1963, from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Voskhod capsule on Voskhod launch vehicle, 2 orbital flights in 1964 from Baikonur Cosmodrome. Gemini capsule on Titan II launch vehicle, 10 orbital flights in 1965 and 1966, from Cape Kennedy. Apollo spacecraft. 2 orbital flights on Saturn I and Saturn V launch vehicles in 1968 and 1969. 9 lunar flights on Saturn V launch vehicles from 1969 to 1972. From Cape Kennedy, AMD Kennedy Space Center. Apollo-Soyuz Test Project. Apollo, Saturn I docked with Soyuz 19 in 1975. Space Shuttle from KSC, 135 orbital flights from 1981 to 2011, including 1 failure to reach orbit. Spaceship-owned suborbital spaceplane with White Knight from Mojave Spaceport, 3 flights in 2004. Space stations are designed for human habitation in orbit for extended periods. The first stations were designed for sorties, while later ones have been designed for continuous, permanent or semi-permanent habitation. The following space stations have been maintained in Earth orbit in the past. Salute, a series of sortie stations, ostensibly for civilian purposes, 4 successful, from 1971 to 1986. Almaz, a series of 3 military sortie stations, disguised as salutes, from 1973 to 1977. Skylab sortie station, altitude 270 nautical miles. 50 degrees inclination, launched on Saturn V, occupied for 167 days in 3 Apollo, Saturn I flights in 1973, uncontrolled re-entry in 1979. Mir, the first semi-permanent space station, altitude 354 kilometers, 51.6 degrees inclination, constructed in orbit 1986 to 1996, occupied 4,592 days, re-entered 2001. Numerous private companies attempted human spaceflight programs in an effort to win the $10 million Ansari X prize. The first private human spaceflight took place on 21 June 2004, when Spaceship-Own conducted a suborbital flight. Spaceship-Own captured the prize on 4 October 2004, when it accomplished 2 consecutive flights within 1 week. Spaceship-2, launching from the carrier aircraft White Knight II, is planned to conduct regular suborbital space tourism. Most of the time, the only humans in space are those aboard the ISS, whose crew of 6 spends up to 6 months at a time in low Earth orbit. NASA and ESA use the term human spaceflight to refer to their programs of launching people into space. These endeavors have also been referred to as manned space missions, though because of gender specificity this is no longer official parlance. According to NASA style guides, planned future programs, the Indian Space Research Organization began work on pre-project activities of human spaceflight mission program. The objective of human spaceflight program is to undertake a human spaceflight mission to carry a crew of 2 to low Earth orbit and return them safely to a predefined destination on Earth. The program is proposed to be implemented in defined phases. Currently, the pre-project activities are progressing with a focus on the development of critical technologies for subsystems such as crew module, environmental control and life support system, crew escape system, etc. A study for undertaking human spaceflight to carry human beings to low Earth orbit and ensure their safe return has been made by the department. The department has initiated pre-project activities to study technical and managerial issues related to undertaking crewed missions with an aim to build and demonstrate the country's capability. The program envisages the development of a fully autonomous orbital vehicle carrying 2 or 3 crew members to about 300 kilometers low Earth orbit and their safe return. The United States' National Aeronautics and Space Administration is developing a plan to land humans on Mars by the 2030s. The first step in this mission begins sometime during 2020, when NASA plans to send an unmanned craft into deep space to retrieve an asteroid. The asteroid will be pushed into the Moon's orbit, and studied by astronauts aboard Orion, NASA's first human spacecraft in a generation. Orion's crew will return to Earth with samples of the asteroid and their collected data. In addition to broadening America's space capabilities, this mission will test newly developed technology, such as solar electric propulsion, which uses solar arrays for energy and requires 10 times less propellant than the conventional chemical counterpart used for powering space shuttles to orbit. Several other countries and space agencies have announced and begun human spaceflight programs by their own technology: Japan, Iran and Malaysia. National spacefaring attempts. This section lists all nations which have explored human spaceflight programs. This should not to be confused with nations with citizens who have traveled into space, including space tourists, flown or intended to fly by foreign countries, or non-domestic private space systems. These are not counted as national spacefaring attempts in this list.